Shalom to each of you here on the Zoom call and those who will watch this class lecture on YouTube later. For the first 25 minutes or so, I'll teach this section of the Bible. Then we'll let everyone on the call into a conversation for questions and answers for the last half hour. And this will include comments about all the themes or ideas that I'll bring up. Further discussion happens even deeper in our discipleship groups that happen over the next week. Maybe you'll conduct a D group in your sphere of influence. I want you to consider that and consider whom you want to invite so they can be processing with us these series, these lessons. For those watching on YouTube, please read the next Bible chapter before you watch the rest of this. Today we're going to be studying and discussing Joshua chapter 5. Go ahead and press pause, read the chapter, then press play on your machine and rejoin us. Thanks. Welcome back. God instituted something long before Torah in his relationship with Abraham, his friend. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord promised him a son, different than the 13-year-old in his house from Hagar, his wife Sarah's handmaid. The new son, whom we know now is Isaac, would be the son of promise. The agreement between God and Abraham would be sealed with a ceremony of circumcision. And no sooner had God given him the words of promise than Abraham took Ishmael, his 13-year-old, and Eliezer, Abraham's servant, and all the men of his household, and along with his own body, had every male circumcised. Genesis 17. That's a substantial and a visible covenant agreement. For the next few hundred years, every Jewish male entered that same covenant agreement on the 8th day of his life. To this day, every Jewish male is still circumcised on the 8th day of his little life. A scientific fact, a note that I find fascinating, is that according to all medical researchers, the highest level of the blood coagulant vitamin K is highest in a man's body on his 8th day of life. Who would have even thought that? Who would have known that? Only God, who designed us and who asked Abraham to begin this ceremonial agreement almost 4,000 years ago. Amazing. Who was circumcised? Jewish boys in Abraham's and Isaac and Jacob and the 12 sons of Jacob, and then in Egypt during slavery, in Auschwitz in the camps, in Europe during the Black Plague. Throughout our history, this was standard practice. Now I say that every Jewish male entered that agreement on the 8th day of his life, but I leave out a generation that did not subscribe to that covenant. They took themselves out of the formula and out of that religious observance. Who was that? It was the generation that wandered Bamidbar in the wilderness. During the 40 years before today's readings event in chapter 5 of the book of Joshua, the Jewish boys born in the wilderness were not circumcised. The question of why not is not answered. It's not even asked in the text. Beginning in verse 2, we read that Joshua commanded the people to reinitiate the ceremony. Why? Well, verse 7 says, because none of them was circumcised during the last 4 decades. Simple. Or is it? 2 questions I see in our text. One is in verse 2. The Hebrew word is Sheinit, meaning the second time. What does it say a second time? Was there a first time? Would you argue that the Genesis 17 account was the first time? That's clear that it was in Abraham's day that the ceremony began or was first installed. There is a tradition in Sifre that the Jewish people gained their freedom in Egypt because of a national circumcision event just before the Exodus. They derived that, as all good halachot, from Exodus 12, verses 44 and 48. Maybe I'll read those to you. Exodus 12:44 says, "But every man's slave purchased with money after you have circumcised him, then he may eat of it. And then in verse 48 we read, but if a stranger sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near to celebrate it, and he shall be like a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person may eat of it. That then, in Egypt, according to Sifre, would be the first event. When we entered the land of promise here in Joshua 3 and 4, when we crossed over the Jordan, then our first act would be a Deutero event, another mass circumcision event, thus a second time, another national event, if you will. The issue, however, is not when the first occurred, but rather that the covenant is renewed. That's a theme throughout this book, and even the final charge by the aging Joshua at the end of the book. Will we honor God in our lives? Will we represent him well? Since you know what happened next, let's back up and see verse 1 then in context. The Jewish people had just passed through the Jordan River and set up stones to remember that magnificent moment. They wanted to remember God as our tour guide and protector, thus the 12 stones. He is sovereign, he's mighty, he is with us. The news about God was not limited to Israeli national news. The nations of the Canaanites heard the news, and their hearts melted. The Jews were coming. The Jews were coming. Like the redcoats in the U.S. Revolution, the proclamation at Bunker Hill or here in the Promised Land is the same. The military forces are bigger than us. We're going to die. But ponder that for a moment. Were the military forces bigger than the Amorites or the Canaanites? Not at all. But God had made the children of Israel look massive and dominating. He'll do that again and again in this book, and dare I say, again in modern days, like in the Six-Day War in 1967, when the nations of the Arab League attacked little Israel and then turned and ran in retreat due to the military might of Israel. God can make the weak appear strong. Now back to the recent surgical episode. Verse 8. The men of Israel are now weakened. Their operations were successful, and they remained in recuperation until they were healed. But the Hebrew word doesn't come from the word Rafa, meaning healing, but chaya, meaning life, until they were living again. Look, if one part of you is not working, if you stub your toe, if your ear has tinnitus, then nothing else really matters. It's as if you're dead to the rest of the world and its woes, and even dead to the joys that they might bring you. Verse 9, the name of the place is Gilgal. Why? Galal means rolling, like the rolling hills of Galilee. Gilgal is where God rolled away the iniquity or the reproach of Egypt. Not the reproach of the wilderness, but the reproach of Egypt. Davis, and I thought I'd show you the book, Dale Ralph Davis writes this book. It's his commentary. It's a series of sermons, I think, when he was in the pulpit at his church on Joshua. He calls it No Falling Words. That's the subtitle of the book. I read this, and I like it. I read lots of commentaries. I think one here that I'll show you is especially good for translations and commentaries. Davis says this, a note of irony there is in the wilderness generation. And he cites verse 5, that they had been circumcised, but they did not listen to the voice of the Lord. So he says, hear the warning. He's telling us. You can have all the marks of the people of God, but lack the response of the people of God. You can receive the sacrament, but have no faith. You may live in the king's country, but reject his sovereignty. I guess it's not the physical act of what somebody does to you, but rather where your heart is. Remember, don't be like those people who all died in the wilderness. Don't be like them, but hear his voice. And when the Bible talks about hearing his voice, we put our faith in what we're hearing. I think the apostle said, faith comes by hearing. And verse 1 in our text today highlights that, doesn't it? It says, Vayehi kishmoa kol malchim, when all the kings of the Amorites shema, when they heard, they believed that the Jews were coming. So their faith went towards what they'd heard. We ought to live in that kind of hearing what God said and responding in faith. Look back at verse 6. God swore twice, once to the nation in rebellion and once back in the day to the fathers. Be sure that God will accomplish his purposes and make happen his plans. What God did with the wilderness people does not negate his original plan and purpose for Israel. We are his. We belong to him. He made us. We're the people. We're the sheep of his pasture. He's our shepherd. Even so, there are some who walk away from God's plans and refuse to listen. There are those who know the truth, say the truth about our own sinfulness and our need to repent, but then they refuse. There are those who insist they know better about how to live their lives than what God said to do and how to treat others. There are even Jewish people who are criminals in white-collar crimes, even here in Sydney. That reality does not negate the truth that God keeps his promises that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, and so many more. Some timely food issues are in the next 3 verses. Timely because for those watching this on YouTube or reading later, this lesson is being given on Erev Pesach. We start the Chag tomorrow night. The lesson of the mention of Passover highlights the ending of the Exodus account. Even that it's on the 14th of the month of Nisan that we celebrate. That's an inclusio, I suppose we could say. It started 40 years ago and it ends just now. This is from beginning to end. This is one of those ways we look at biblical data and say, where are the parentheses? What's included within that? And so God started something on the 10th of the month of Nisan. Remember, that was last week's episode, before we were crossing the Jordan on the 10th of the month. And that reflected the Exodus 12 account. On the 10th of the month of Nisan, we were to take a lamb for ourselves. And then 40 years later, we are entering the land, the very land that God promised. And now, on the 14th of the month, we killed that lamb and we ate the lamb and we escaped Egypt on that night. And so it is that now as we enter the land, we've got some food issues and we're going to take that. Now, mind you, there's no mention of lamb or horseradish, the bitter herbs themselves, but we're moving into a place where cereals, barley and wheat will become normative, a land flowing with milk and honey. And it says that the manna shut off. That is, that we no longer were going to eat manna that we had had. So in verse 12, the manna ceased on the day after they'd eaten some of the produce of the land, so that the sons of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate some of the yield, the cereals, of the land of Canaan during that year. We were now provided something new. The promises are being fulfilled. We don't need the temporary fix of the manna. That's pretty good. Then we see in verse 13 to the end a most unusual beginning of the military campaigns to take over Israel. You start with You're going into the land. So we've got this idea of preparing to enter the land. And then we're going to enter the land. And then we're going to take the land militarily. So what do you need when you're going to take the land? You need some military folks. You need the general to show up. You need the military plans. You need the war room. You need all that. Verse 13, now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho. So he'd moved west. They're now moving ahead. That he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man. That's it. Just a simple word. Is he somebody significant? A man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand, and Joshua went to him and said, are you for us or for our adversaries? Are you for Parramatta or for Penrith? Are you for Kansas City or Denver? Are you wearing stripes? Or are you wearing blocks? Are you with Arsenal? Are you with Tottenham? I don't understand. What team are you on? Because I can't tell by your look. I don't know who you are. You're not wearing the clan's clothes. Your tartan is not showing. And he said, are you for us or for our adversaries? Because that's how simple life is. When you're in a military command like Joshua, the general, the new general, and he comes and he sees a fellow. Now, I find this unusual that out of all the hordes of people who are around, and Joshua, the commander of the army, would have other generals and sergeants and lieutenants around him, and he now is faced with one fellow. Who is this man? Are you on our team or the other team? Are you somebody I'm supposed to kill? Are you from the 7 nations? Now that's a question that he should ask later with the Gibeonites. He doesn't do that. We'll talk later about that. And the man said, no, rather I indeed come now as captain of the host of the Lord. Wow. Hi, I'm on God's team. Yeah, I'm sorry, that wasn't one of the choices. Could you go look back and see option A or option B? And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down. He realized he was in the presence of God. What has my Lord to say to his servant? I was so wrong. I thought you were just an ordinary fellow. And now, because I'm getting ready to go take the land. Sorry, I didn't pray first. Sorry, I didn't seek God's counsel, a word that will come back to haunt him. I'm sorry I didn't do that. And the captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Of course, you recognize that. That's exactly what happened when Moses went up to Har Sinai, and he saw the bush that was on fire, and he kept having excuse after excuse in why he shouldn't lead the people, why he shouldn't comply with or do what God was asking. Joshua here, it doesn't say Joshua took off his shoes, but you can bet he did it. He'd heard the story. Taking off your shoes because the place where you're standing is holy, and Joshua did so. What was he saying? God is in this place. The presence of God makes this place holy. And I'm going to comply with what God wants. Joshua starts the military campaign with prayer. And if you're smart, that's what you'll do in every one of your activities. If you're smart, spiritually smart, then you'll do that no matter what day or against whom you intend to fight, or whatever your situations of life. When we are thinking life is binary, we've got this under control. If I don't go there, I'll go here and I'll make things happen, it'll be good. And then we encounter something totally, we could say, out of the blue. We don't know what to do. What should you do? Are you on our team, or should I try to remove you? I don't know spiritual stuff. I'm not that spiritually keen. I'm not that spiritually aware. So what do I have to do? I have to pray. And the man says, no, I come now as captain of the host of the Lord. I'm on God's team, and God is here with you. And when you realize God is with you, what do? You kneel down. You cry out, God, I'm not worthy. You cry out, Lord, you're looking at the wrong guy. You need the strong, the spiritual titans. I mean, there are a lot of them. I see them on TV. I've heard them at the congregation. There are some really prominent people. They know Hebrew and Greek and they're like really good, and they're really good people, and they've got wives and kids, a wife and many kids, and they're all loving God, and you don't want me. You want one of those prominent people. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy, because God is here. What makes a place holy is not the accoutrements or you've got Hebrew and dictionaries of the Bible. That's not what makes it holy. What makes it holy is that God is there. And if God is there, then nothing else really matters. So that's what I see in Joshua chapter 5. Next week, I hope you'll join us as we carry on in chapter 6 and learn much more about what God has to say to us as we take lands and cities and lose lands and cities. We're delighted you joined us today. Join us next week and from now on as we try to stay on track in 2021 and beyond. Happy Passover to you who will celebrate that on Saturday night. Next week, I hope to see you again. We'll be right at the end of Pesach, and we will have some final thoughts on Passover and then Joshua chapter 6 as well. Until then, Shabbat Shalom.